Very much, Flo. So I'm Louise. I'll do an introduction to myself as a person, as a parent in a minute. But I just want to talk a little bit more about this taboo that we're going to be covering today. So as Flo has said, each year we focus on a range of different taboos, and we go through a research process to identify which are the taboos that people feel most uncomfortable talking about and most want to hear more about. And shame SEN parenting was one of the taboos this year that rose to the surface. And it makes sense that that's rising to the surface given what we see in the media around challenges in the education system right now in getting access to support in schools, in terms of getting access to EHCPs, in terms of potential changes in the system, in terms of difficulty getting access to diagnoses and the waiting list that we see for all of that. So there's a lot in the media that's kind of creating noise and sometimes some confusion and even misinformation around this topic. Um, this is a broad topic that we're covering today, and we're going to be focusing on a few different themes that relate to how we as parents experience parenting our children who have special educational needs or additional needs or who are neurodivergent. Of course, these aren't necessarily always the same thing, so you could be neurodivergent and not have additional needs or special educational needs. But the way that we've named this taboo is shamed SEN parenting, so trying to reflect parenting children who have some kind of challenge in accessing education. Because often, if they are neurodivergent, then the educational experience is not going to be totally plain sailing for them in the way that it might be for a neurotypical child. We're going to be talking about how parenting children such as ours can be very different as an experience to parenting neurotypical children, and how that can create a disconnect for us from parents who are in in more mainstream parenting culture around us or online, and how that can make it feel difficult for us to connect with parents around us, like at the school gates if our children go to school. We're going to talk about how parenting children such as ours can result in challenges that are sort of really unexpected, really different from what we expect in terms of the course of our lives, and how we grapple with that. We'll talk about the ways in which misunderstandings and misinformation are really kind of proliferating online in this country and in others. And you know, related to, for example, misinformation around why there's been an increase in the rise of various diagnoses and how fundamentally all of that misconception, misunderstanding, or sort of ignorance, as Mark has talked about in his brilliant last podcasting episode, really feeds into stigmatization of parents and children. We'll talk a bit about the difficulties that children such as ours and us as parents can face, often behind closed doors, and why those issues can be so hard to talk about. We'll talk about the impact of parenting children with additional needs, SEN needs, on us as parents, on our well-being as parents. And we'll look at all the positives that we can find. And fundamentally, us being here together tonight talking about this is a positive. We're coming together as a community. We're supporting each other, we're learning from each other, and we're uplifting each other. So we'll talk about the power of communities, of parents and close friends and family who get it, and the massive plus side of social media in all of this. You know, Mark, you've got your podcast and your Instagram. Lucy, you've created a community locally. Lisa, you've got your incredible book and your hilarious Instagram account, and all of that represents resources that each of us sitting in our homes behind closed doors, going through our kind of difficult experiences, often in private, can really sort of tap into to feel less alone. And sometimes the humor that we see across all of that can really hugely help us. So we're going to be talking about ways in which we feel like we can't talk about our lived experience as parents, or that when we do, we have to filter what we say. And the other sort of dimension to this taboo is that there's negative judgment from others. So we're going to explore why that negative judgment comes, and sort of in terms of and the sort of gap between what we can communicate and what we experience, and the impact of all of that. So kind of what we can do to break down the gaps and the blockages that create the stigma that we experience as parents. So I've been waffling on for quite a bit now. I'm going to stop talking and ask our wonderful panelists to introduce themselves. Just tell us a little bit about yourselves. And the formula we like to try to do now for this, to be as inclusive as possible, is to ask people to share their pronouns if they're comfortable to do that, and to share a visual description if you are comfortable to do that. So I'm going to ask Lisa, would you like to go first, please?
I knew you was going to pick me first. I know why. I am Lisa, known as ASD with G&T online. My pronouns are her. Is it her and she? Is that right? I'm asking you what my pronouns are. I've got no clue.
Correct.
Many know me as a knobby influencer online. I hate that word, influencer. Content creator. But I've also got a best-selling book which is called Raising the SEN Betweeners. I've got 2 autistic children, and I've recently been diagnosed with autism myself. And I really wanted to create a book that was about the ones that are kind of in between, like my children. So the ones that are sort of not severe enough for SEND school, but also can't cope with mainstream. And basically just about my journey, which I've shown online and everything, just because it's very lonely and isolating a lot of the time. And because of exactly what we're talking about tonight, where you're sort of met with judgment and things like that quite often. So I wanted to create a community where we all get it, we all understand, nobody judges anyone, and yeah, so that's me.
Thank you, Lisa. Lucy, would you like to go next?
Hi everyone, thanks for joining. I'm Lucy Dumrold Simpson. I'm mum of 3 boys. My oldest is autistic, and I'm a social worker, and I coach parents with, I guess, managing sort of the realization that their child might be autistic through to kind of getting what they need in the HCPs. And I'm also sort of developing some training for professionals around recognizing autistic burnout in children in schools. I guess my motivation really to kind of start doing this was when I was really struggling, when things got difficult for us. There wasn't really sort of a service that met the kind of specific needs of parents who were going through this. There was a lot about, supporting your child with their behaviour or generalised counselling and therapy, but just not a space to sort of sometimes even just really be heard and just kind of dump in terms of what's going on to someone who really gets what you're going through. And I kind of tried counselling, and it sort of always felt like they were questioning why I was continuing to just talk about my child the whole session. That was the only reason why I was going for counselling, generally. And so the parent net kind of came out of that. But really, I think the importance of this, like Lisa's just said, is so much of it is hidden, particularly in school, particularly in the playground, when we're all struggling with our kids, and no one really knows what we're going through. And I think it's just amazing that things are being talked about more, and that we've all got spaces on Instagram, hopefully in person, but even if it's just, through influencers like Lisa and Mark's podcast, to kind of feel like, yes, like they get it. I feel like not quite so alone. So yeah, that's me.
Thank you so much, Lucy. And then Mark, please.
Hello, I'm Mark Allen. My pronouns are he, him, and I host a podcast called Neuroshambles, which has been going for 40 episodes now. And it's a source of joy in my life, as are my children. I've got 3 children, all diagnosed autistic ADHD, but very, very different presentations. And their mum is also diagnosed autistic ADHD. So I describe myself as being the lone neurotypical crouton floating about a spicy soup of neurodivergency in our household. It pretty much sums it up. I am suspected neurotypical. And I am delighted to be here.
Thank you so much, Mark. And I'm Louise. I work in marketing, my day job. I'm the chair of trustees of Talking Taboos. I have 2 kids. Both are diagnosed autistic. One may also be ADHD. And they both are off school at the moment. with in what's known as emotionally based school avoidance. So what I'd love to do is to hear from each of our wonderful panelists about what this term shamed SEN parenting has brought up for you. So what's sort of top of mind when you hear that title for today's discussion? Maybe Mark, would you like to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. I think it's it resonates more with how I used to feel about parenting. I think as I've evolved as a parent and as I've understood more about my kids' profiles, that's sort of diminished a little bit. I think I'm a bit more defiant, shameless, if you like. But in the early days, when you don't know what's going on with your child, and the only frame of reference is looking at other kids and going, my kid's not like that. Those kids walk with their parents. My kid's halfway up a tree. Or, you see them on the school playground and they're interacting differently, and you feel judgment from other people. I think, it's something that Lisa mentioned, and I'm sure we're going to talk about a lot, but you feel judgment from, as you said, the mainstream parents. And you don't know enough about what's going on to really contextualize that. So all I kind of felt in the early days was that I was failing as a parent, because I have an idea of what my kids should be behaving like, and they're not, and I'm trying everything. I'm working really hard and I'm failing. And you internalize that, I think. And and that's really hard. But as I say, the more I've educated myself about their neurotypes, and not just their neurotypes, but each individual presentation of their neurotype and how they react in certain situations, I feel a little bit more empowered, I think.
In that, is there anything about just accepting your situation? It feels like through education, you've come to sort of meet your kids where they're at, and that helps break down that sense of shame. Is that, am I?
100%. Yeah, because I'm not trying to crowbar them into being neurotypical.
Mm,
Because they're not going to be neurotypical. It doesn't matter how much I tell them off or try and punish them, or or get frustrated. My expectations are the things that need to be adjusted, because they're always going to be autistic. I mean, that's not going to change. So what I expect of them needs to change. And as soon as I started to understand that, it meant that I could let go of feeling other people's shame and feeling shame for myself.
yeah, that's a really empowering sort of message to kick us off with, that I think through learning about our kids, immersing ourselves in understanding more about who they are as individuals and their neurotypes, we can let go of some of that shame. What about you, Lucy? What does this term shame SEN parenting bring up for you?
I think, to mirror what Mark's just said, initially, before we fully understood, I think my kind of focus of shame was around what other people thought and felt about what my child was doing. So in the school playground, family members, friends, kind of over explaining, feeling the need to almost like preempt things and say, oh, this might happen, that might happen, trying to kind of hold tight onto everything to avoid people's judgment. But as I've kind of, like, again, like Mark said, with kind of almost really practicing radical acceptance of like, this is what it is. Now, if I feel that kind of shame or guilt, it's more around how I've reacted to a situation when I know that I kind of know better now, which obviously we're all human and we all have moments where we're not regulated, but there's so much focus on the importance, I think, for us to be regulated, to support our children's regulation. And sometimes you just can't, we can all kind of know what we need to do. And even in the moment, you know what you should be doing, but sometimes your emotions just kind of override. And then I think the guilt and shame after that is probably more present for me now than the shame of what other people think. Although I like to think I've kind of got a handle on how I manage things, and it's very rare. But in terms of what other people kind of think and feel about what's happening, that has kind of passed, I think, for me, because you learn that actually all you can really control is how you react, not what other people are going to think about what you can't control what your child's going to do, and you can't control what people are going to, how they're going to respond to that. So it's kind of, serenity prayer in a way, like,
Yeah, but sometimes it's even hard to control how we're going to react, because sometimes
Oh, I know, it's impossible. And and it's also, I think sometimes because we do have to stay so regulated in a way that, I'll see other parents of neurotypical kids maybe being a bit snappy or whatever. And I think, oh, if I responded like that, everything would just go, but then it comes up in other ways because you kind of, you hold it down. But if we don't look after ourselves, and I guess that's the kind of the focus of my Instagram more is about like the self-care aspect of, for us, how do we stay regulated? Because it's all good and well professionals telling us that that's what we need to do. But, we also have fight flight reactions to situations, and we're mammals just like everyone, so it's like holding on to it. Sometimes it does come out and, then we feel like, oh, why did we do that? Kind of going over it. So yeah, I guess for me, that's probably more a factor than what other people think and feel now.
That makes sense. I mean, I really resonate with what you're saying about sort of the shame can be a bit internalized as sort of guilt that results from not doing what you think in theory might be the ideal way to behave or to support your child. Because there's a lot of kind of indirect pressure that comes from absorbing content that sort of talks about how to support your child in burnout or how to support your child with kind of particularly acute needs. And that asks a lot of us, and it can ask a lot more than we can necessarily feel we have the capacity to give on any given day. So kind of that shame can just kind of sit in there if we feel like we can't do what we feel like on some level we want to do or should do. But like you say, we're just human.
And I think that goes for like the different type of children that you have as well, because that is one of the things that I found hard. Like I thought after I'd had Finn, I was like, I've nailed this now. Like I mean, it took a while, but I was like, okay, I understand. This is autism. This is how I need to parent. And then Poppy came along, who's completely different, and has like a PDA profile. Of pathological demand avoidance, and that all went out the window, and I was like, oh my god, I've got to now like sort of negotiate and let her take control. And like you said, it's really hard to not get triggered yourself and things like that. And it's like, especially since finding out I'm autistic as well, like some of their stimming noises and things like that, I feel like I'm going crazy sometimes. I'm like, oh my god. And then you feel guilty for feeling that way because you know that they can't help it, but it's like then you're triggered yourself as well. And it's like trying to stay calm and gentle parent and everything like that is really, really tricky at times.
But do you cut yourself the same slack, Lisa? Do you say, actually, I'm autistic and I'm overwhelmed and that's also okay? And
I'm learning to now. That's the thing. And I think that's why the diagnosis has really helped. Because before that, I was thinking, why can't I cope with this? Why am I not behaving like the other parents that can just sort of block it out and just seem to go, so easily with parenting and everything like that? Why do I find it so hard? But I think that's what's helped with the diagnosis, is that I can actually be a bit kinder to myself and think, actually, I am allowed to struggle with this as well. So I just borrow their ear defenders.
I
Drown out the noise.
I think we spoke about this before, like when they get older, sometimes I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing for them to see that we can struggle, because otherwise sometimes in the family it can feel like it's always them that everyone's kind of managing. And actually to see that other people actually sometimes lose it and get triggered as well helps them maybe feel less othered within the family unit and not always the one that needs the support or
I mean, I think articulating that is, you're modeling it to them, and it's really important. I do that as the alleged neurotypical as well. I did that yesterday when Otto was just really noisy. I was like, this is too much for me now. Like my brain doesn't work like yours because I don't have ADHD, so I can only focus on one thing at a time, whereas you can do lots. So I'm going to need to just I need you to go away for a little bit. And he was okay, but it's about advocating for your own needs in that situation.
Yeah, and I think over time, just planting those little seeds where our kids see that we're struggling, might help them to build some empathy for the experiences that other people are going through. And I have one of my children, is we think may have rejection sensitive dysphoria. So he's very much a perfectionist, thinks he's being criticized when he's not. And we kind of try to lean into modeling messing up and failure and because it helps him to see that we're not perfect all the time. And that's kind of really important for his sense of self-esteem. So actually, Lisa, I just wanted to go back to the fact that you've been recently diagnosed, and I'm just curious to get your take on the kind of trope that we hear people saying quite often out there, which is, oh, it's just a label. And then there's a whole
Everybody's getting diagnosed now.
everyone's got a label these days, everyone's getting diagnosed, but this idea of it's just a label, so kind of perhaps respecting seemingly the fact that you or your child is going through the diagnosis process, but that it doesn't really matter to have that label. What would you say to that? Because I think that's something that can contribute to this shame that we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, it does come up a lot. Obviously, a lot of trolls like to say that as well, about everybody's got a label these days. And usually when people turn around and say that, everybody's autistic these days, I respond to them and say, oh, when did you get your diagnosis? When did your mum get her diagnosis? It's like, it clearly isn't true. The thing is, I try and say to them, the difference is we're talking about it these days, and that is a big difference. People are recognising it more, people are talking about it more, and that is a good thing. And it's so frustrating when people say it's a label, because you just don't get that with anything else. I've never heard, my mum's got arthritis. I've never heard anybody say to her, you went to the doctors and got a label of arthritis. It's a diagnosis. It's a medical diagnosis. So it's so frustrating. And I think some of it is sort of, tends to be a lot of old school way of looking at things. And a lot of people think that there was no autism in their day and everything like that. And I think when you sort of delve into it more and speak to them about it, you find out, well, don't you remember the shy kids, or the ones that you called weird in your class, the ones that you didn't speak to, the ones that, and everybody usually will remember that child or those couple of children. And it's like, it was around. It just wasn't spoken about. It's so frustrating because we know how important that diagnosis is, for our children, for us to understand ourselves. I would say to help to get support, but we know that that's a bit hit and miss at the moment. More miss, but it should help to get more support and things like that. And that is, one of the biggest problems is getting the support out there and getting people to listen.
Yeah, there's quite a few funny memes on the internet that are about sort of like me looking for the support that's going to magically be there as soon as my kid gets her autism diagnosis. And it sort of riffs off the idea that there is nothing really, nothing kicks in immediately at all.
You get a leaflet usually, a nice leaflet.
And I think I've heard a few people say, and I think it really resonates, that it may, to the idea that it's just a label. Well, if your child doesn't have a label of neurodivergence of some form, they're going to be labeled some other way. They're going to be labeled naughty or weird, like you say, Lisa. They'll just be a label that's much less, really unpleasant that could be applied to them, based on misunderstandings. So what I'm kind of interested to talk about a bit further now is the fact that this taboo is about us as parents, and it's about the people around us, but it's also fundamentally about our kids, right? And one of the difficulties in dismantling taboos around that sort of sit within this overarching taboo of SEN Parenting is that it's about our kids, and that can sort of place some limitations around what we can say, and where and how. And I really kind of see this in communities that I'm in, that there's some dark stuff that Flo alluded to at the top of this session that parents can be experiencing. Child to parent abuse. They can be experiencing kids having really violent meltdowns, suicidal ideation, really severe eating disorders. It goes on. And these aren't things that we're going to necessarily talk about openly, because it's about our kids. And I've seen that when you start to learn that other people are going through similar things to you, it can just take such a load off, because you can feel so isolated with some of this stuff otherwise. So I'm just really interested to know more about kind of your perspectives, each of you, on what you feel like you can say and where you can say it and how you can say it and what that means for how we can talk about this taboo. Lucy, do you want to maybe sort of kick us off on that? Because I know you're you're very thoughtful about this.
I am. I think it's probably because of my social work background, coming from a safeguarding background and social media and having kids. And I obviously see the extreme end of what that can look like. So I'm, I guess, more, guarded about what I share about my kids online. I think it's really difficult because obviously the whole point is to be relatable, but to be relatable, you've got to share. And the more you share, the more interested people are in you online. And I realize that there's probably a limit to the traction I'm going to get because there's kind of quite a firm line that I've got around what I'll say, no photos of my kids, no kind of direct examples really of situations with them, just because I know they might one day choose to look up my Instagram, and if it's an open profile, I just kind of wouldn't ever want them to feel like I'd violated their privacy, like their story. However, that's very personal, and everyone's got a different line on that, and everyone's children are really different. But I know that my child would be like, no, absolutely not. You're not going to talk about me because people follow you that know us and they know it's me, that kind of thing. In terms of who I do feel, so I keep it quite general. And also, obviously, my work means I've got kind of like confidential examples of situations that are relatable. And I think I can still, we can still be relatable without sharing real specifics in terms of kind of general scenarios. In terms of what I personally feel safe in sharing with, it's really only with people who have been in the kind of situations that are as extreme as I've been in, as we've been in as a family, because I feel like there have been times where I've trusted perhaps family and friends, more so friends, I would say, with situations and perhaps not got the response that I would have expected from a trusted friend in terms of suggestions of how perhaps I could have managed a situation. Or I always feel like it's really telling when you come away from a scenario where you've shared and you feel like you've overshared, because when you share with the right people, I don't feel like you get that feeling, because the reaction that you get from them makes you feel kind of held and safe. Whereas I'm an overthinker anyway, and I'm like huge empathy, oversensitive. And so now I'm very kind of conscious that I don't want to be in a situation where I've said something that someone else has probably forgotten all about, and I spend a week kind of thinking, oh my God, like, what do they think about like me saying that? Should I have shared that about my child? Have I breached their confidentiality? Because people kind of tell you what they think by sometimes what they don't say. And so I think, I'm very careful. I've got trusted people that I know whatever I say is not going to impact kind of the relationship. And, I know that they, even though they don't get it, they want to get it. And I've got a few friends that have got neurotypical kids who are really thriving, who some of the situations that we kind of talk about, they're just like, what, like they cannot even imagine like being in that situation, but they want to try and understand, and they take the time to really listen, and that makes me feel really safe. And family who obviously just unconditionally, even where maybe they get it wrong sometimes, but I know that they unconditionally love our kids. They love my kids. So even if sometimes the things they say, I think, not quite on the ball there, but I know it's coming from a good place and a place of love. And then friends who have got similar kids, and we've got kind of community group in Bath where we try and meet up as much as we can. And when we can't meet up, we've got a WhatsApp where we sometimes just end up dumping in there. If you're in a situation like, oh, this is really awful, like I'm really struggling today. Or even if you've done something you feel like you didn't react in the right way, that you can share it on there and no one's going to be like, oh God, terrible mother, whatever. Just those safe spaces where everyone's kind of at the level, because I think also depending on the profile of your children, I think the PDA profile is quite specific. And so you can be sharing with parents whose children are autistic, but some of the stuff that comes with the PDA, and particularly when you've got a child who's been in burnout out of school and they're really struggling with their mental health, and some of the more extreme ends of behaviours, some parents whose children are autistic who are managing a mainstream school, to them that might even feel like, oh my God, like this is, really quite frightening. So yeah, being with people who aren't kind of shocked and alarmed at some of the stuff you say, I think is really soothing. And before I had that, I just felt like there was really nowhere I could go to sort of share what was going on. So yeah, it's amazing to have like that community of people that just really go, yeah, okay, like that's really bad, but you know, because we can all kind of go down rabbit holes with it, can't we?
I
There's some
do
great
agree with
sorry.
you with that.
Yeah, there's some great Facebook groups out there as well. There's
Yeah.
on the lighter side of PDA is a particular favorite of mine. If anyone's not seen that one, it's actually moderated by Rebecca Hussein, who's been one of the amazing guests on Neuroshambles. And it's just really, it's one of the rules is it has to be funny, because you just get to that release of like, yeah, we're all going through this, but understanding that other people are going through the same thing as well. So important.
Like you said, without that judgment and everything, like that, you know, I've got group chats with my friends who have like higher care needs children than mine and stuff like that. And, you know, we talk about, you know, oh, mine's been smearing over the walls and things today. And it just doesn't, nobody's like, oh my God, like, do you know what I mean? And you need to hear that. Like, you need to not have that shock and things from other people around you. And sometimes you don't, and I know that people mean well by it, but sometimes people come with their suggestions all the time, and you think, oh, there's no fix to this. Like, I know you're trying to help, but you know, they'll be like, have you tried this? Have you tried that? And you're thinking, oh my God, we've tried everything. But
It's not just the shock. It's not so much the shock as the judgment that goes with it. You know, when you say things, it's like, I don't mind. I will say things to some of my friends who've got neurodivergent kids, and they might be shocked, but they're not judging me. And
yeah,
so then,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
because regardless of what sort of profile your children has, there are so many commonalities between parents of neurodivergent kids that even if your situation doesn't exactly mirror theirs, they get it. They understand, you know, they've got a similar variation of it. So you don't get that judgment. And it feels so much, as you were saying, Lucy, just that you're sort of held with a shared bond.
I think as well that, you know, a lot of us with neurodivergent kids have um, learned that it's not a static thing. Obviously, what we're dealing with changes as our kids grow up, as they go into different educational settings, hormones, life experiences. So I think a lot of us have a sense of, you know, even if an experience that a friend has isn't what we've had, and it might seem shocking to us, you know, we never know what's going to happen to us. We never know what we're going to be dealing with. And sort of, I think we can bring that sort of an empathy to hearing about the experiences of others, because we don't take for granted the things that are going relatively smoothly for us, because you just never know what's around the corner, do you? Nothing's predictable, nothing's linear. You can get curveballs all the time. What about for you, Lisa? How do you sort of decide what you talk about and what you don't? And because when we spoke before, you said you were sort of now having to start to sort of think a little bit about that with the age of your kids, and kind of think about or think differently about that. Think about what they're comfortable with you sharing online. Can you tell us?
yeah, it really hits home when Lucy talks about that, actually, because when we're talking about the shame and things, I actually have a lot of shame, especially for me in the beginning. I think I was a little bit naive, I think, because I didn't have such a big following then. And I am an oversharer. And, you know, I tend to overshare things in order to try and find my people. And, you know,
I
but
do.
yeah, and I think by doing so, but it wasn't my story to share. And I think, you know, I probably did overshare a little bit too much at the beginning of this with what my kids, like you said, with them looking back, would they have been comfortable with that? And that still worries me to this day. And I think, oh God, did I do too much? Did I say too much? You know, now I can have a conversation with them. You know, Finn quite often says to me, you absolutely cannot say that, and I will not. And you know, he sees what I post, Poppy sees what I post, and you know, it works quite well like that because we do have that communication there. And you know, there's a lot of things that I would like to share, especially as we're going hormone stage, and we're dealing with early puberty and things like that, but I can't. And you know, that's my kids' wishes, and I have to honour that, because I don't want to ever damage our relationship. But it's tricky, because you do desperately want to talk to people about it as well. You do want to reach out and find those people that get it as well. And it's tricky, but it is, you know, there is a line that's not to be crossed. But it honestly is something that I worry about all the time. And
But
you know, with my book as well, like, because I put about my depression a lot in the beginning, and how I didn't enjoy being a mum. So, you know, the kids, you know, Poppy especially keeps saying to me, I want to read your book. And I'm like, you can't, because you won't understand it at the moment. And I just hope that they will get that, you know, they're the best thing that ever happened to me. But there was a roller coaster along the way. But it is something that does play on my mind all the time. And I think,
But you're having that conversation with them, I think, which is
Yeah.
wonderful.
Yeah.
I've tried to have that conversation with mine. They're not interested in that at all. Jay was like, who wants to listen to people's moments on a podcast? I've seen
Well,
your
I think
parenting,
Finn
it's
is like
boring.
that a lot. It's like, it's very boring. Finn doesn't want to read my book at all.
Yeah.
But
I go through a similar thing of being really, you know, well, just thinking a lot about how I portray my kids. I anonymize them. Their names are anonymized in the podcast, but you can work it out. I mean, if you know me, do you know what I mean? So I'm constantly thinking about that, and I do. But my podcast, I feel like, comes from a place of curiosity about them and fierce advocacy of them and understanding their neurotype, and try, like, that's the balance I'm trying to do, is to be able to advocate for them. And in my mind, like, I listen back to it and think, what would the kids think if they heard it? And I don't think that they would listen to it and think I was being mean or unfair or unkind. And
No.
I think if I can sort of have them as a potential audience in mind, then I think I'm okay. So I've edited some things out before that might have been a bit less charitable, let's say.
It's really hard, isn't it, that balance? Because like, and it depends on your child. I've got a very curious, highly intelligent 12-year-old who wants to see the website, wanted to listen to this today. And, you know, even the website that I've got for the business, it's like looking at it and it's like basically parents who need support, because he would interpret that as, oh, these parents need support because their kids are so difficult, because that's, you know, it's like, how would he, it's just kind of, what would they infer from what they're seeing? But then on the flip side, we have conversations and it's like, it's amazing that you're doing this. I think it's amazing. I think it just changes as they mature and, you know, their kind of outlook on things. So yeah, I think sometimes just having a conversation can reassure you and make you feel like, actually, you know, it's fine. Like they, you know, not overstepped.
But it is important. It's really important for me to share what's going on. You know, the warts and all view of life and the challenges that we face, because I know in the early days I needed to hear that, because I was hearing people on podcasts saying, this is what you should be doing and this is the ideal situation and here's the homework you're supposed to be doing. It's like, I just want to hear people going through a rough time as well.
Yeah.
You know, so it's not just me.
Being honest, that it's hard sometimes, and sometimes it's not enjoyable. And that's the thing. I think, you know, sometimes, what do they call it? That toxic positivity can be just as damaging. Like, you know, hearing everything's great, everything's fine, you should appreciate every moment. It's that kind of thing. And it's like, well, you know, some days are really shit, and it's hard.
Yeah. And let's be honest, our kids can pick up on that toxic positivity a mile off.
Yeah.
Not buying that.
No.
It sense the fakeness of it. So I'm interested to know a bit about how the extent to which we feel like we're listened to and believed as parents. You know, some kids are very high masking, so school settings or other people like grandparents don't see some of the challenges that they have. Or we may just describe things that are happening behind closed doors to professionals, and they may just not believe that we're kind of that's really happening, or they may think that it's perhaps something to do with how we're handling the situation rather than just how our kids sort of intrinsically is, or where they're at with their kind of mental health. How much is that a challenge for us when we think about this issue of shame, that we're kind of that we're not believed or that we're gaslit? Do we experience any of that? As
I think all the time. I mean, I experienced it at the beginning of school with Finn because he was masking.
Mhm.
And it's funny because me and the head teacher actually clashed a lot in the beginning, and now we get on really well. But you know, in the beginning, she did think I was the overreacting parent. I was the helicopter parent, and you know, I was getting upset about nothing because at school he was appearing, you know, fine, and you know, he was academic and very quiet, well behaved. And at home, he was absolutely exploding and having the biggest meltdowns, and you know, really struggling to get him into school. And then I'd call for this emergency meeting with the teacher and everything, and be like, "You've got to help." And Finn would walk in and be like, "No, everything's fine." And it's like, "Oh my gosh, you're making me look like a crazy woman." You know, and you know, she did say to me, I think, you know, sometimes with the first child, it's, you know, it's hard to let go, and it was sort of, you
Mm.
know, saying it was me, and you do start thinking you're going mad.
Mm.
And it was only when the masks started to drop that they were like, you know, "Oh, we're starting to see what you're talking about." And it was like, thank God he's having meltdowns at school, which sounds like such a weird thing to say, but you want others to see what they're experiencing.
It's such a common experience, isn't it, that our kids hold it together in school,
Mm.
and then the sort of the difficulty of that, the pressure of that mounts, they kind of they let it out at home, but the stress of that just accumulates and accumulates and
Mm.
accumulates, and schools just don't necessarily see it, or
No.
they don't obviously know what's going on at home, even if we tell them, and they
And
think,
that's what makes the diagnosis journey so hard as well sometimes, because obviously you need evidence from the school
yeah.
to get you know, they don't just take our word for it, obviously. Why would they? So you need evidence from the school, and if they don't see that, it's really difficult to get them on board with it and to get them to understand it, which is where, you know, I found logging incidents really helpful. So if there was a meltdown when they came in from school, we just like wrote a quick note saying this is what happened, and then you afterwards, obviously not at the time, you deal with the situation as it happens, and then make a log of it, and you build up a really good picture of their profile and how they respond in certain situations, and you see patterns. But also crucially, you can present that back to the school and go, this is what's happening. You're not just look at the amount of different incidents that have happened as a result of this, and like we know he's got PE on a Monday morning, so therefore maybe there's a thing there. But it's that, at least it's surprising when how many of those incidents you end up logging, because you sort of forget in the moment.
Yeah.
And I found that really helpful to help the school understand their profile.
And see some of the patterns and the things that might
Mm.
be causing it that they're just not noticing. What about for you, Lucy? Does this kind of issue of parents just not being understood, or kind of worse, really being gaslit, resonate with you at all? Because I know that you're kind of looking to educate schools in the work that you're doing now.
Yeah, I mean, it's really difficult because we had a really, really tricky experience with school, and my other two children still go there. So as a parent, in terms of like our trauma, because it is traumatic, you know, getting those
Mm.
phone calls from school that your child's, you know, struggling or whatever without giving detail, and you know, you feel like, oh my, you know, what's happened, that kind of feeling, the trauma of, you know, basically forcing them into school because school want that tick, knowing that something's not quite right. And getting to the point where you're saying they need an EHCP, and it's like, oh no, we're not quite there yet. And then when finally your child falls apart, suddenly, oh, they need an EHCP. And then it's like, you know, I found that like meetings were never minuted, so things were kind of said and then they didn't happen. Or the minute like I kind of became quite assertive, I'd go to a meeting and there'd be like 3 members of staff in a meeting and just me, sort of as though I was going to kick off. You know, there's kind of an inference that you're being difficult, you're being obstructive. And for me, like, I'm used to dealing with professionals. I'm used to people listening to what I suggest, because obviously I've been like, you know, child protection conferences, all these kind of things. And I think it's really hard because you expect that level, but it's like, no, you're just a parent, which is really wrong. But the response that you get as a parent is so different. And it's been really good for me professionally to see what it feels like being on the other, you know, being a parent surrounded by professionals in a meeting. And I think also it's really hard because, you know, school are probably doing what they can with the resources that they've got, and this is by no means like talking down schools, because they do an incredible job. And if you've got a dysregulated child in a class of 30 kids who's potentially, you know, gonna get really, you know, really struggle, then it's really difficult to manage. But I think I felt like I was saying he needs additional support above the funding that you get from a diagnosis. You know, I do things like say, I know what funding you're getting, where's that money going? And that in itself is almost seen as you being difficult. But it's like, well, you should know where that money's going. And obviously in a lot of schools, it just goes into a big pot, and I understand why. But it's like, well, my child's still struggling, so what's that funding being used on to scaffold him in school? And even when you start asking those kind of questions, I definitely noticed a sort of shift in climate around, you know, trying to have meetings, and almost seen as kind of holding people to account as almost like you're being difficult, which is really, really hard when you've got other children at the school and you want to maintain that relationship. I think also I've really struggled when school broke down and we had some really traumatic scenarios at school. I found it really hard once he'd left to go back into school and no one ever said, oh, how's he doing? How are you? It's almost like, oh, here she is, you know, avoid, because it's just too difficult to go there. And I was, you know, I was really quite broken, I think, at that point as a parent. I think it's really hard to kind of put into words unless you've been through, you know, seeing your child sort of go into burnout, go out of school, and kind of everything falls apart. But for no one to kind of say, oh, how's he doing, when he'd been there for a number of years, and you know, it just felt like really that I found that really hard. I think also the local authorities, you know, I felt very gaslit by them over the years, really, in terms of just the fight that you have to, we've not really touched on this, but just the fight to get them what they need, even when schools say, okay, yeah. And even when you get an agreement to assess, the suggestions that they make, you know, like a child struggling in a mainstream and then they're saying, oh, they've got to go back into mainstream. Even just hearing those words, you just feel like the frustration and the panic and the lack of control is just, you know, completely overwhelming. And you do feel like you're going slightly crazy. And then it's like, sometimes I guess in meetings, even if you're just being assertive, it can come across as you're being too, you know, too much, too over, like demanding. But it's the only way.
I think a lot of the shame side of things definitely comes from the local authority, from what we've seen over the years and the things that they've come out with, you know, that the parents are in it to get a golden ticket, you know, and in it for the benefits, and you know, all of these things that have come out of some of these counsellors' mouths and things. And it's like, that doesn't help to, you know, when the general public are listening to this, they start to believe that as well. And it's, you know, people don't understand how much we go through to fight for them just to have an education. You know, real basic stuff here. And it's like, you know, and we're almost made to feel that we're the demanding ones. And, you know, it's crazy. It's like, you know, we just want an education for our kids that's
just the basics. I know. And actually, when they're not in school, we're not even saying, well, someone needs to come and care for them when their tutors are in and out. It's like, well, we'll do that bit, you know, but that has massive implications. You're just literally asking for the bare bones, you know. Just a little bit of tutoring here and there, and it's like, oh, you know. too demanding. It's really
Yeah.
frustrating.
Yeah, the whole idea that you're kind of we any of us would be in this to get the golden ticket or there's additional benefits. I mean, the effort that goes into getting whatever we get, it's grueling, isn't it? You had a podcast episode, Mark, that horrified me early on with humor, but it horrified me. It was about all the paperwork and the processes to get, I think,
That's
to
the most downloaded episode of Neuroshambles. Is the Am I allowed to swear on this?
in my book you are, yeah,
Okay,
go.
it's called So Much Fucking Admin episode, and it's episode 8, and it was just the journey of like paperwork and the process of sending stuff in and having to phone to check that they've got it, and then also having to check that they've read it, and then keep chasing them for a response, and just the amount of admin that is involved in that. And it is, they're overwhelmed. And this is the thing that is frustrating. It's like, if you're honest, if they were honest with us, you don't have the resources or the budget to be able to do this. Don't put it back on us as being unreasonable. Be honest with us. Like, I understand it. I appreciate it. I get it. But by putting it back on us, you're trying to, you're labeling our efforts, as insincere or, inauthentic. And then that shame comes back, right? And you think you're going crazy.
Yeah,
It's like, I'm not. I'm definitely not. So
yeah,
let's just have an honest conversation about things. You don't have the budget, and my child's EHCP needs to be filtered down to loads of other kids who don't have EHCPs. So therefore, you can't provide the education that he's legally entitled to. But at least let's have that honest conversation.
Yeah, rather than making out that we're basically lying and,
Yeah.
just making up all these things that they need. And, and there's, it even comes down to like transport and things where there's a lot of shaming around that. And I've spoken about getting transport before on my page, and the amount of people that are like, well, why should your child get transport to school? Mine doesn't. And like, because your school is down the road. My child's is an hour away because that's the nearest SEN school. It's like, and people don't seem to understand that, and they genuinely think we're just being lazy and just can't be bothered to take our kids into school. And it's like, we have to travel miles and miles to find the correct place a lot of the time. Like, and I can't possibly get 2 of them to school at the same time when one is going to take me an hour there and an hour back.
No, and also, like, I don't want my child to have to go in a taxi like 20 miles away to a random place in an area that's not familiar to them. Like, that's not optimal for my kid. I want them to be part of the community. I want them to walk to school and see local people and feel like they're accepted as part of the local, school community. So it's like, no one would wish that for their child. And quite often, you don't know who they're in the taxi with. That causes a whole nother load of anxiety about, are they going to manage that? Because our children are very sensitive. So already school's difficult. And then you get them in a taxi, you don't know who they're going to be in there with, what that dynamic's going to be like. Is a whole nother stress. It's definitely not something that we're kind of, trying to, what can we get out of this? A taxi. Woo.
I know. And I think that's the point, is like, I would like nothing more than for my kids to be okay in school.
yeah.
Not even academically brilliant, just to actually literally be in that environment so I can go to work and be confident that they're not going to be dysregulated, they're not going to be melting down, they can just bumble along, do their thing, come home and not have a meltdown at the end of the day. I would love for that to happen, but it doesn't. And so these are the accommodations that I'm fighting so hard for. We are fighting so hard for. So many people are fighting for these accommodations, and you still get people pushing back and trying to make you feel ashamed of that.
Oh, that's exhausting, isn't it?
We're all exhausted just thinking about it now.
I know, as if we've got loads of energy to start with. It's a whole other job fighting for these accommodations and pushing through the paperwork, isn't it? It's a full-time job. So
I would say it should be the other way round. Like, and I know, like, all the parents like of neurotypical kids would hate me for saying this, but I'm like, everybody should possibly start off with a SEN school, and then all the neurotypicals have got to fight for the mainstreams and go through all of that. Because
I love
it makes more sense. Like, we don't have all this time on our hands. Like, we're dealing with meltdowns and, like, a lot of us are neurodivergent ourselves and can't
Love
cope with
that.
the paperwork. It's like, it makes more sense for the
you have
neurotypicals to do all the paperwork.
I love it. They go, have you got any evidence that your
all
child is
it.
neurotypical?
Yeah,
Because I'm
amazing.
not getting that in school.
I mean, fundamentally, all of this is about our kids not trying to cope, let alone, thrive would be wonderful, but cope at the very least in a world that's not built for them. And I love the idea that we just flip all of that on its head. That seems like you've solved it. Um, what do you, if you could sort of bust any myths or dismantle any major misunderstandings that contribute towards any shame or sense of kind of isolation that you ever feel as parents, what would you most want to kind of tackle? And maybe Mark, you've got some right off the top of your head because you've just done a podcast episode on tackling ignorance, and
That's only part one.
part one, yeah, there's
There's
so
I sat down through this is crazy because yeah, there are so many judgments that are made. And I just put a post on Instagram going, I'm gonna do something where we're gonna tackle ignorance, and it's gonna be things that we've sort of said today, where autism is just a label, and it's I've heard some crazy ones. And so I put it out there and said, has anyone got anything that people have said to them that they want us to kind of talk about? And it went nuts. Like, so many people wrote in. And so me and my guest kind of go through them all. And it was, we didn't cover them all in one episode. So it's gone to a second episode. And it's really fun just kind of smashing this nonsense. And I think there's the one that frustrates me the most, I think, is when people assume that your child is naughty. That's the biggest one for me, because my kids are very fizzy and they're very loud and they are full of energy and full of life. And not everyone appreciates that, and not everyone sees that through charitable eyes. They think they're being naughty. They think they're out of control. They're too loud. Children should be seen and not heard. That is definitely not the case with my children. My kids are heard well before they're seen. Um, so that, I think, because now understanding more about neurodivergency and understanding how different neurotypes present, I approach children's behavior very differently now. I don't judge in that way. I don't assume they're naughty. Usually I look at them and go, yeah, he's definitely neurodivergent. I can spot it, and but naughtiness is not the go-to, because I think that's rarely the case from what I've seen. It's usually some undiagnosed neurodivergency, or an attempt to get them to fulfill expectations that they're just not ready to meet yet.
Yeah, I think that's why it's so important for us to talk about this, and to find the right language to do that within communities of parents like us, and then sort of cascading that out to friends, family, professionals, because the more that people understand that that behavior is communication and that there's potentially something that lies beneath it, right? It's not just that the kid is being naughty, the better. The less there'll be shame and judgment and isolation for all of us.
I think it depends what people class as naughty and like rude and things, because
The bar's pretty low in my house.
I've learned to I find it weird now when my kids are very blunt, and sort of they'll say what they see. And we've had it before where they will say things to people, like we've been around people's houses and they'll be like, it's really dirty in here, and I'm like wanting the ground to swallow me up and things like that. But what I love about our kids in general is sort of what you see is what you get with them, and it's like there's no manipulation there. There's no they're not going to pretend. When I dread people giving them presents and things, because if they don't like it, they are just going to go, I hate that. And it's like, is that rude? And it's that kind of, trying to determine what they can help and what they can't help. And it's, you know, I think that's, people would see it as rude or naughty behaviour and stuff, when it's actually, you know, I see it very differently now, because I'm like, it's literally, they're not doing it to hurt somebody's feelings. And I think that's the difference there between naughty behaviour, would be they're intentionally doing something to hurt someone, whereas they've got no awareness of that, if you see what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
There's such a positive fundamentally in that honesty and that transparency.
I think so. And I think, because obviously we've talked about a lot of the difficulties, but like in our house, we don't do kind of socially constructed ideas around, I guess, respect your elders, respect this person because they're a teacher, because it's very much on a person-to-person basis. If you give me reason to respect you, I'll respect you. And just almost starting from scratch and all those kind of social norms going out the window, it's like, I find it really refreshing. It makes obviously life sometimes a little bit more complicated, but ultimately 9 times out of 10, you know, what my son says is valid and probably right. And he's just not kind of going to just do something just because he's been, you know, conditioned to do it, which thing. And yeah, it I guess for some older generations that can be difficult, but it's also, I think, the way it should be. You know, the idea that you respect someone just because they were born before you, when you kind of spell it out, it's like, yeah, that kind of, you know, makes no sense. In terms of what you were talking about, like challenging things, I think for me, language is really, really important. Like the term score refusal, in my work, I hear that a lot. And aggression, aggressive, they're aggressive when a child's kind of dysregulated. And I really struggle to kind of not challenge it at every opportunity, with people who just see, I guess, children who are struggling as just being really difficult and not trying to unpick what's going on. And I think those labels are so dangerous, particularly, I guess I'm probably sensitive to it because I've got Black children, like mixed race boys, the kind of, you know, the term aggression, perception of kind of negative stereotyping, I'm really kind of sensitive to it. And if that's used, and it was used actually in the cover letter for a ZHCP about 4 times, and I made school rewrite it, which is when the kind of mood changed, I think, towards me. But yeah, I just think that feeling of like perception in society of when our children are struggling, of them being seen as a threat, particularly as they get older, like if you're in public, that is kind of a real I guess anxiety for us as parents that we carry when we're out and about, because we have to hold that and manage it with other adults. But yeah, language I think is really, really important, and it doesn't seem to be a discussion that's happening kind of in education really. I have expectations of kind of senior management and kind of head teachers that perhaps sometimes, you know, I'm really shocked and surprised at the language that they use and their kind of view of what's going on for a child, where I'd maybe expect like a teacher or a TA or a newly qualified teacher, you know, to struggle with that. But yeah, it doesn't seem to be something that's discussed in training, or, you know, so that's kind of really
like
important.
you said as well, there's a lot of sort of negative language used around a lot of our kids' behaviours, and things like even PDA, pathological demand avoidance, just doesn't sound nice.
I
And
don't really use it because I find it really difficult.
well, I think a lot of people now use persistent drive for autonomy, which is so much better, so much better. And it's like, you know, it's really weird how they've sort of, like you said, they've been stuck with these labels still on them that are actually really, really negative terms. I mean, even, you know, I call myself ASD with a GNT because that's what we've all been diagnosed as ASD. But, you know, I've heard that they're trying to change that to condition instead of disorder now, which is good. But it does, the minute that you hear those things, you are automatically going to start thinking negatively, because they're not sort of good words to use around it all.
Yeah, a lot of
negative
from the baggage around that language, doesn't it?
Yeah, and for our kids to hear it as well. It's not nice for them to hear that about themselves.
No.
No.
And I think kids, ADHD kids, there's a stat that I'm not going to remember exactly, so I'm not going to quote it, but there's a stat that you'll easily find online about how many negative messages ADHD kids hear about themselves. And it's no wonder that low self-esteem is so correlated
Yeah.
with ADHD, because
Yeah,
they're told they're being naughty, calm down, stop doing that, you're being aggressive, this, that, and the other, and they internalize that.
Mm.
I
I
think that as well, when school breaks down, that message of like, school is the one place that everyone can manage. And if a child can't manage school and they're removed from the classroom and put into isolation, and, you know, the impact of that, and we've talked about this before, you know, it's like how much of what we see when children are out of school, when it breaks down, is kind of organic to their needs, and how much of it is the trauma of basically being made to feel like, you know, they're not welcome, they're not accepted in the place that
Yeah.
everyone else is accepted. It's really hard.
very hard. Is there anything you'd most want people to know? That whether it's friends, family, school, local authorities, is there anything you really would kind of, if you could just one thing that you want people to know that would help with this issue of shame that we're dealing with?
I've got one.
Go on.
Believe the parents.
Thank you.
For like that being
Yeah.
a starting point, because it
Yeah.
seems that you have to convince them. Like, we've been through it to even get to the point that I'm comfortable sharing it with someone. There's been a lot of whispered conversations and a lot of research and a lot of doubt, and you know, it's been horrible to get to that point. So when you actually then speak it out loud to someone, that's a massive moment. I don't know if everyone else remembers the moment that they first say that to someone. I remember the first time I talked about Jay's diagnosis to someone who was a close family friend, and they rolled their eyes at me. The first person I ever said it to out loud, apart from my partner at the time. And that was just so laced in judgment. I felt horrendous when that happened. And it was just a sign of what I was going to face for the rest of the journey, right? Is that this lack of belief when you try and tell people what's going on with your child, because we know the best, right? We know our kids the best. We're around them the most, and we have done a lot of research to understand their profiles and how their brain works and how they react in certain situations. So the one thing I would say, just believe the parents first.
Thank
I
you.
even had this recently. We took Poppy to hospital, and she had to be well. I told them that she needed to be put to sleep. She needed to go under an MRI scan, and I knew even for adults how terrifying
Yeah,
that
it's
is,
horrible.
with the noise, being in that tunnel, and I just knew she'd be hysterical. Told the doctors over and over again she needs to be put to sleep to have this done, and they gave her melatonin, and
What, she's
said
gonna
to
have a
me,
doze?
yeah, and said to me it'd be fine, she'd go straight to sleep with that. And I was like, she takes melatonin like every night, but this is not going to get her to sleep. They would not listen at all. And lo and behold, she did not go to sleep. She was thrashing around. She was hysterical. It was one of the worst experiences. And I made a really huge complaint to them. And the doctor called me up and she said, I'm so sorry. She said, I'll be honest with you, it's because we had an autistic boy a few months ago, and we gave him melatonin and he went to sleep. So I assumed, I was like, but I told you, as the parent, I
Yeah.
knew that she wouldn't listen to me at the time because they'd had experience with one other autistic child.
That's frustrating and ridiculous.
Yeah, it really is.
That was such an awful experience for you and Poppy. I dread anything to do with hospitals.
Oh, awful.
It's a whole other world where our kids are not necessarily going to be easily understood and supported, and it's,
No, I mean, the whole experience there was just, I mean, there was one doctor that, because Poppy had gone into flight or fight mode, basically, because of everything that was going on. And so she was making a lot of demands, you know, quite hysterically. And, you know, one of the doctors called her bossy. And I'm like, to a child with PDA and autism, I was like, there's just the lack of understanding there. And I think that, you know, in so many professions, like, there needs to be more training done on, you know, our children's needs and things like that, because it's just, they don't get it. They do not
No.
get it.
Thank you. And then Lucy, is there anything you'd particularly want people to know? Any one key kind of message you'd want to share or have people to kind of absorb?
I think I would like, particularly professionals working with children, to just really try and stay focused on the child, like on their lived experience, on what things feel like for the child. You know, really try and get into the kind of head of, if you're dealing with a child who's struggling in a family where, you know, the behaviours are really difficult, it's behaviours that challenge and it's difficult to manage. And this is for parents as well, I guess, but mostly professionals, just to really try and think about what it feels like for the child and make that kind of the place that you start from, rather than seeing the outward behavior and making an assumption about what needs to happen. Just, yeah, considering the why, because this is a kind of a strange analogy, but I always feel like as adults, if we're in the workplace and we're not managing, say we're having a nervous breakdown or off stress, we get sent to occupational health for them to consider what's going on. Whereas with children, we don't even afford them the same consideration. They're just almost assumed, you know, that they're, I guess, a threat or badly behaved. And yeah, it's almost like we have higher expectations of children when they're struggling with their emotional mental health than we do of adults, which just seems crazy to me. So yeah, I just feel like things could be more child-centered rather than sort of process-driven when things are starting to fall apart a little bit. And also, please know that parents, even if they do get shirty in meetings, it's because they're in burnout as well. And they're dealing with daily micro traumas on top of chronic stress. And so the parent that you get is the parent who's brokenhearted, who is so stressed, who is worrying about money because they might have to stop work, who is supporting their child who might have mental health problems, who might be self-harming, and holding together other family members and children. So if you get a parent and they are a bit rude to you and they are a bit shirty, whilst we know that that's not acceptable, it's not about you. It's because you might be the first person that they've had to talk to about this thing that is basically feels like the whole world's falling apart.
Thank you. That's such a powerful point. I want to just bring flow back into the conversation to facilitate any Q&A that we have. There's been tons in the chat. I don't know how many people have sort of put things into the Q&A as yet, Flo.
I have one to kick us off with, and then if anybody else has anything else in the chat, just drop it in there and I'll see it come in. So we had a question earlier on when you were speaking, and the question was about the best way. What is the best way to support siblings in understanding difficult behaviors, but also attempted suicide and thoughts of suicide? So yeah, that was a question from the chat we've had, and I'd love to put it to you all.
I don't know I wonder if Lucy, you might be a good person to start with, kind of with your social worker hat on, perhaps, on that one.
Yeah, I mean, obviously anything in relation to mental health of that degree, I think you need to, if it's imminent, then you need to go to hospital or you need to call an ambulance if your child's kind of, showing signs of suicidal intent kind of now. So if that is happening or does happen, then you need to call 999 straight away to get emergency care. If it's something that's happened and is not necessarily an imminent issue, but you need urgent support, then you can speak to CAMHS, you can speak to CAMHS duty. And, you need to really, I guess, keep calling them if they kind of fob you off, or if they, if you're kind of waiting for an outcome, and also go to your GP. So you can self-refer to CAMHS. You can also get your GP to refer and get schools to refer. Sometimes people feel like if one referral has been done, then the other agency or you don't need to do it, but it tends to be more powerful if it comes kind of from all different angles. What was the other part of the question in relation to siblings?
So I think it was both kind of supporting siblings to understand difficult behaviours was the it's quoting, it was in quote marks, and we've talked about the language problem already, so I'll do the same. Yeah, supporting siblings to understand difficult behaviour, of which that was one example.
I guess also it depends on the age of the sibling and how age appropriate is to explain in terms of what language you use and what tools you use to do that. I would always recommend for siblings of children who are autistic to have support from young carers. Obviously, some children, depending on the age, don't like to just go and be dropped off, but they do, in most local authorities, they have really good kind of provision for sort of activities, fun stuff, just a nice time. And also just building in one-to-one time with siblings yourself, which is something I really try to do. And I know it's practically can be really difficult, but just so that children who are kind of living with, I guess, the stress levels that it sounds like you're managing, get that time out of the house just with you, to give them just a space to just be and just have a nice time with you to talk about what's happening. Even if you're not directly talking about sort of addressing the concerns, just some general chat about, how like, how you finding things at school, and is there anything that you're worried about, or even just having a nice time and giving them that space to share anything. Obviously every child's different, so yeah, I guess it just depends on the child, but if you are at all worried about kind of imminent risk, then obviously you need to call 999 and speak to CAMHS for follow-up support. But it is really hard. It's really hard conversations to have with, particularly if it's younger siblings, really, really tough. So my heart goes out to you, because that's just not an easy conversation. And I think quite often what happens is conversations that normally as adults we would hide from our younger children, when things are kind of exploding at home, it's very hard for them not to hear what's going on. And then so you've kind of got their trauma to try and support them through, which is really, really difficult.
There are some groups as well, I think, that do sort of days out for the siblings and things, but I can't remember what they're called now. I
The
could
young
put it on
carers one is one of those
the
ones
young
that was a
carers.
really good,
Again, just to kind of build on the point about sort of what you might do might depend on the age of the child. There could be a message in there that's about, and obviously I don't know what this parent's kid is actually sort of specifically going through, but that suicidal ideation is not the same as the risk of actively committing suicide, and of course you never know when ideation might shift right into sort of action. And I know that can sort of, that trajectory can happen quickly, but ideation around suicide is so much more common than I think many of us realize. And we've got a whole other taboo on silent suicidal thoughts actually that we're going to talk through later this year, and it's actually, I think, a lot more common than many of us realize for our children to express suicidal thoughts, and it's an expression of how much they're struggling. It doesn't mean that they necessarily want to die. It can just be an expression of kind of the anguish that they're in, and it's the way that they express that. So depending on the age of the siblings, of being able to help them and to understand that it doesn't necessarily mean that they're siblings at that kind of point of seriousness. It can be just they're incredibly upset.
They just want it to stop, basically. And it's hard. It's really hard to hear that from a child.
Are there any other questions, Flo?
Yeah, I just wanted to, there's just one chat at the moment from Rosie, who mentioned that her daughter is 4 years old and awaiting a diagnosis for autism, and she's high masking and starting reception in September. She's already feeling like they don't believe that she struggles with transitions despite SENCO backing us up. She's concerned that she'll struggle going into school and that they will try and push for them to have her in school when she's having a meltdown. How could she advocate for her and support her? She's already told them how traumatic she found going to preschool and they didn't believe her.
it's so frustrating. It's like what we said about them not believing the parents. I would personally call for as many meetings as possible with them and find a sort of key person that the child feels safe with, that they could possibly speak to. What really helped Finn was just to have a little card to hand over, because it's actually really difficult for a child. It's difficult for an adult as well to say that you're struggling and that you need help. So for like an autistic young child, it's even harder. So we gave him a card that he would literally just put on the teacher's desk, which would tell them that he needs help, he's struggling, without him having to actually say it. The teachers would then know that they needed to take him off and try and sort of probe it out of him, if you see what I mean. But it's you have to have a good school, I think, really, and good teachers is the main thing for them to really listen and understand. It's really, really tricky with masking. There are books that you can get to read, like one of them's called Perfectly Norman, and it sort of shows about unmasking and how it's better to show your real feelings and everything like that. So, you know, getting them to do books like that, read books like that, could always help. But it's hard at such a young age.
I think it's
But they do. Sorry.
having that good relationship with the Senko is really important. And it sounds like this person is already doing that, which is fantastic. It's just open up that conversation, because when people hear autism, they probably have one or two presentations in mind, but as we know, it's so multifaceted that it's on a person by person basis, and you know your child and their triggers and what is going to help them sort of ease out of dysregulation better than anyone. And it's about you having those conversations early on and explaining to them how your child presents, and essentially giving them a user guide for how to help your child in those situations. And it's just opening that communication.
Also, just to cut in that, also most local authorities have a service that sits under social work, which is like early help, so team around the child. If you're struggling to get the school to kind of understand what you're saying, you could request that they complete like an early help assessment, so that there are like regular meetings with professionals to kind of ease the transition, so that you've got the Senko from the nursery or the preschool with the Senko from the school that she's going to, and anyone else who's working with her. I don't know what other kind of support is in place, to kind of almost make it that the professionals are kind of sharing it rather than it all being on you, so that it becomes like they're more accountable for all that information being shared about every scenario that she'll find difficult, plan for each scenario, how she's going to, you know, how they're going to integrate into the classroom, exactly what's going to happen on the like first settling in day. Because I find that by having kind of a professional framework like that, it means things are minuted, there are actions, and things actually kind of move, rather than, oh yeah, we'll do that, okay, we'll talk about that later, and then it comes to the first day, nothing's in place, and all your kind of fears, you know, are happening. So if you maybe look into what early help support there is in your authority that you live in, you can request, yeah, like it's called it's either like, some places still call it a CAF, Common Assessment Framework, some people call it TAC, Team Around the Child. It just varies from local authority to local authority.
Fantastic, everybody. That was
start that. Nurseries usually do them, so they'll start the assessment and then call a meeting.
That was really, really helpful, and lots of really practical advice as well. And now that I love the idea of the card, and hopefully that helps lots of other people struggling with this as well. I have another question which I'd love to ask before we've got 3 minutes left, so it won't be a quick one, but I think it's a really important one. So it's how do you make your child feel safe and listened to regarding EBSA when school insist on you as the parent bringing them in anyway and spending an hour coaxing them from the car? I feel like I'm letting my child down, breaking their trust in me and contributing to their distress. Louise, I saw you nodding a lot along. I wonder.
I've got vivid experiences in the not very distant past that are exactly like that. And because my kids both burned out from school very quickly, and I think the school just didn't quite know what they were dealing with at the time. And I felt such a lot of pressure to get them into school. I felt at the time that there was no other way. Um, I couldn't conceive of a situation where they were not going into school. Um, and the effort that we had to put in to keep getting them into school when they were crying, when they were having one of them was struggling to get to sleep late at night, crying, getting to the front door, not going any further, getting to the car, not going any further, getting to the school campus and not going any further. It went on for months and months and months with each of them, and it was terrible. And I think the more that I pushed, the more I traumatized them, sadly. But I didn't know any better. It was what we're told that school is the place they have to be, and it's the best place for them, and they need to get an education, and we're not helped to understand that there's other ways. And I did sort of mislead them, particularly my eldest, where I kind of had to sort of covertly try to get him in for a meeting and then sort of managed to leave him there and run off. And that was, that's not going to help. So I think, I mean, there's no easy answer to this, but I think it's having the confidence to listen to what your child is telling you through their behaviors, their upset, their the fact they're not getting out of the car, and knowing that that's signaling that they're not feeling safe and comfortable in school, and having confidence to not kind of force them into a situation that they can't really cope with. And making sure that the school understand what you're dealing with at home. So we would sort of have many conversations with the school to say, these are all the things that we're dealing with. This is what has happened on this morning where we have been trying for hours to get our child into school, so that there's never any risk they're thinking that we're just not trying hard enough. But yes, it takes a lot of resolve because we're not supported to let our children just sort of not go in if it's for their mental health.
Yeah, and this comes back to the shame as well. Parents get fined for it. I mean, that you're so wrong that it's actually illegal, and the shame that you feel on that. But this is one of the earliest opportunities for your children to advocate for themselves and to help them do that and to help them express that. And it's hard because you've got to go through that judgment and that shame and the feeling that maybe you're just giving in to them and you're mollycoddling them, which is what a lot of the older generation will tell you. Heidi Maver wrote a really good book, which was about that. Your Child Is Not Broken. If you haven't read Heidi's book, which starts out with that, her feeling of shame trying to get her son Theo into school, and how damaging that was to him in the long term and to their relationship. And obviously they're super close now, and it's a happy ending. But that's a really good, really accessible book to read that might help around that.
And also, don't be afraid to actually change their school sometimes. I know that sounds really extravagant, but not all mainstreams are bad. Some are better than others. And I think sometimes, I know I felt this with Finn at the beginning of his, this was it. This mainstream was terrible, and that was it. This was going to be our life. And actually, some that have specialist provisions within them and things like that, or you've got some that have had teachers that understand, and some of them can be a better experience than others, and some of them will offer reasonable adjustments and things like that, whereas some won't. So don't ever be afraid to look at that option of actually changing the school as well, even though obviously the change would be probably horrific at the time. But over time, it can sometimes be another option.
Just one note on that. We went down the route of speaking to the paediatrician and getting kind of medical sign-off for kind of emotional mental health, so that we weren't kind of hounded about attendance. In the same way as if an adult, if you were, going through a period of breakdown, you'd get signed off by your GP. And then sometimes you can explore hospital education, which is sort of tutoring and different provision, alternative provision for kids who can't manage in school, and that can cover mental health as well. So I would always speak to your paediatrician, because essentially if a medical person authorises your child to be off, then school will leave you alone. But until you get that, you know, we had situations where we couldn't get our child in, and then I'd meet with school and they'd be like, oh, there's the attendance officer. We'll arrange for you to meet with them soon. It's kind of like, why? Like, I can't, they're not coming. But yeah, I think it's really, really helpful to get that medical perspective so that you don't feel that pressure.
This has been so fantastic, everybody. I'm afraid we've gone over by 3 minutes, but I'm really sorry about, but there's always so much more to say. And I just want to say thank you so much to our panelists, and Louise, thank you for chairing this beautiful discussion and for all of you sharing so much